and someone will be online to assist you. Finally, if you want to ask questions, simply type them in the box at the bottom, and at the end of the session we'll have some time to answer these. Now at the end of the webinar we have a quick survey that we'd love you to complete, and this will help us understand what you took from today's session and what else you'd like to hear about. We'd really appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to fill this in. Now remember, everything is totally confidential. The only people that will see your comments or questions are Paul, Jez and myself. So feel free to comment on what's important and ask as many questions as you need to. Finally, we'll be recording this session, so there's no need to take notes. Just sit back, relax and enjoy. Okay, so what we cover off today, we're going to look at why we have engagement surveys and share some history around them, discuss how businesses typically respond to the results, share some perspectives from a company that's turned itself around and take a look at what they did, and talk about the TakeON approach. What would we do differently and what's our advice? So let's get started, and it's my pleasure to hand over to Jez, who's going to start by sharing some insights from a case study.
Hi everybody, and thanks for joining us. Thanks Chrissy. What I want to do first off is to give you a little bit of an insight into one of our big case studies. This is a large supermarket chain in the UK called Morrison's. Now our role at Morrison's was we were hired to transform the customer experience, so focus solely on that in a lab environment. Now interestingly, there was another consultancy working in Morrison's at the same time in a completely different business unit, and their focus was entirely on engagement. So why would we use this case study? Well, the results sort of speak for themselves. It was really successful for us. After just 6 months, we managed to turn the pilot store, turn their customer experience round. Out of an estate of 413 stores, we moved them from 402nd right up to 116th within 6 months, which is pretty impressive stuff. The most interesting thing about that case study, though, is that, remember, we weren't working specifically on engagement. We were just trying to transform the customer experience, but at the same time, engagement also improved. Significantly as well. It went up from 55 to 70%. That's some 15 percentage points. And remember, that is an outcome of other stuff that we were doing in that store. Quite impressive stuff, I think you'd agree. So what are we going to do now? I want to set the scene and talk about engagement surveys a little bit. And to start us off, why not let's take a little bit of a look at the history of employment surveys and their origins and how much we really know. And let's start with a poll.
Okay, so we are going to start with a poll, and we want you to vote, and this is a chance for you to share your views. So we want you to tell us, how long do you think we've been measuring engagement? So some answers will come up. We just want you to select one of those to vote. So do you think it's been 10 years, 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years, or even longer? So vote now. We'll give you 30 seconds. Remember, just to select one answer only. So while you're thinking about that and doing your voting, just to put it into context, if we think back, 100 years was 1913, 200 years ago was 1813. Do you think it was longer? How long do you think we've been measuring engagement? Okay, so please keep your answers coming through. We're going to be closing the poll in a few seconds. Okay, so we're going to close the poll now in 3, 2, 1. Okay, done. Okay, so just to summarise what's come through, 50% thought we'd been measuring it for 10 years, 25% 100 years, and 13% of you 200 years, and another 13 even longer. So, Jez, what's the right answer?
Well, if you were to look back in history, Chrissy, you'd actually find that, I think, how many was it? 13% of you were absolutely right. What we've got here is an interesting little timeline. So when I did a little bit of research behind this, I could go back as far as 300 BC with the times of Alexander the Great. Apparently, he was an avid fan of the employee survey engagement, and he used to pop up and down the front line, just checking in on his men all the time. Fast forward 2,000 years and you get to World War II, and we were doing exactly the same thing then, assessing battle readiness. Into the 80s, into the 90s, and I guess that's the point at which we started to get really quite serious about employee engagement surveys, particularly in the organisation. And we started to get much more scientific about the sort of questions that we were answering and the way that we were monitoring and reporting that information. By the time Buckingham and Kaufman wrote First Break All the Rules, that bestseller, things had really changed, and we were getting really, really sophisticated. I guess today You've got organizations like Gallup and Connexa and OCI, just to name but a few, who are right at the heart of a multi-billion dollar business. So we're getting very, very good, and we've got very, very good at measuring and analyzing this sort of stuff. So what sort of a difference is it actually making to employee engagement? Paul?
Thanks, Jez. Well, if we take a snapshot of the current state, although for the last 20 years at least we've been really seriously looking at surveying employee attitudes and employee engagement, the fact that we're doing all that work, the suggestion would be that we're not actually using that outcome very productively. If we look at the latest survey from Gallup released this year, they suggest that only 30% of people are actually engaged in their jobs. So that's around about 70% are very completely disengaged or rather ambivalent about their workplace. So we're not necessarily using the results pretty well. But let's not lose the perspective here, because engagement is a really big business and it's an important business. We can be absolutely sure these days that the correlation between employee engagement and business performance has been established. We've chosen just one example here from Dr. Bob Nelson, self-described motivation guru, and his research suggests that there's a very strong relationship over the long term in terms of companies with the level of engagement and what that means to financial return over a 6-year period, up to 200% higher financial return. So the relationship is there. Those numbers will vary from study to study, but there is definitely a correlation between employee engagement and business performance. So not surprisingly, engagement has risen up the management agenda, and rightfully so. And some would say maybe it's just a case of what gets measured gets done. And I think that's part of the problem, because this stuff tends to often only get done when it's measured. What do I mean by that? Well, sometimes you see some quite interesting behaviours around the time of the engagement survey taking place. For example, I've seen managers rushing around giving positive feedback and having conversations about development with their team a week or two before they know the survey is going to take place. I've seen one company wanted to run big team conversations right across the organisation, having everyone discuss what are the great things about our company. When did they want to do that? A month before the engagement survey. So it seemed to have driven an approach where we're focused on influencing the score or the result rather than focusing on the underlying drivers.
I think that's absolutely right, Paul. And I guess what we're really saying here is that the most important element of your engagement survey might not actually be your results. It's more about what you do with those results. It reminds me of that very famous quote, "The problem is not in the thinking, it's in the doing." So let's take it to the next step then, and let's focus on that doing element. So what are we doing when we get our employee engagement results in? Chrissy?
Okay, so time for another poll. This time we want you to tell us, what do you think is the typical approach from a business when they receive engagement results? So there should be 3 answers that come up. We just want you to select one. Is it 1, focus on the laggards, 2, set up working groups to present results, or 3, set up a target for percentage improvement? So vote now. Remember, select one answer, and we'll give you about 20 seconds this time. So think about the common approach that you take in your business today, and do any of these actually ring a bell in terms of what you're doing with your survey results? Okay, we're going to close the poll very soon, so keep your answers coming and remember to select one answer only. We're getting some good responses through, and we're going to close the poll now. So I'll just count down in 3, 2, 1, closed. Okay, so 50% of you responded and said that you'd most likely focus on the laggards, and the other 50% were setting up working groups to present results. So Jez, is there a right answer?
Actually, yes, there is, Chrissy. And you're all right, actually. It's a combination of all 3, and they all seem to be typical responses that we see. But to share a better insight, we actually went out to our TakeON community and our LinkedIn group and our Facebook group and through the internet. And we asked that simple question, so what's your take on engagement? And we got some really interesting stuff back, particularly this response from a guy called Darren Hill. Darren's based in Sydney, but you can just see the frustration coming out when he writes, does this process sound familiar? You create a world-class survey, deploy that survey, hold focus groups, analyze the data to death, devise a very clever plan, get some cross-functional teams together, secure management buy-in, cascade initiatives, communicate widely, secure some sponsorship, and hey-ho, 12 months has passed and it's time to survey again. And actually nothing's been done. We've tracked some progress, but nothing's been done. And I guess this is the frustration, that when we get our survey results in, we tend to fall into the trap of some very familiar habits. And I guess to summarize, this is what they tend to be. First of all, we focus on the bad stuff. I guess we can't help it. It's human nature to focus on what's not working and where we've not done so well. The second thing is we turn engagement into a project, maybe the project of all projects. We get lots and lots of people involved, spend lots of money, and all of a sudden we're treating engagement as if it sits outside business as usual. And we know that that's not the case. And I guess the third thing is we might set a target for percentage improvement. And all we've done is we've turned engagement into an issue about points and percentages as opposed to people and performance. So what sort of an outcome does that, if we do take those responses, and that's what we do, what sort of outcomes does that drive? Well, I guess the first thing is that engagement will only ever be a once-a-year thing. And from an employee point of view, you sort of get that feeling of, oh no, here we go again. It tends to drive our vision backwards instead of forwards. And I think I'm a firm believer that maybe we should start from a position of what does the future look like, or what could it look like. Whilst looking backwards is important, it's a good measure, but it's a moment in time. And maybe we should be spending as much time looking forwards as we do backwards. And I guess the third thing, and lastly, the third thing is that we tend to look for a big win or a quick win. We just focus on what's the one thing we can actually make a real impact on. And we tend to ignore all the other stuff that's going on in the organization, all the other opportunities where we can improve. So there's got to be another way. There's got to be a different approach. And I wonder what that looks like. Now, recently, Paul was over your way, actually, in Silicon Valley, and has got some insights to share.
Thanks, Jez. Yes, I'm just back from having spent some time in California and in Silicon Valley as part of a tech company industry tour. And as you'll know, Silicon Valley is interesting because the competition for talent is so high that it's pretty much mandatory these days that companies have a good culture. Today I want to focus on Yahoo, just as one example. And what interests me about Yahoo is that since 2005 the company's actually been in quite marked decline. But a turnaround started about 12 months ago with the appointment of Marissa Mayer, who took over as CEO, coming over from Google. And here's what she said at the time in terms of her thoughts around what really matters in terms of business. She said, I believe that really strong companies have strong cultures. Each has their unique and individual flavour. I want to find Yahoo's and amplify it. That is how you find the energy. You can harness that into innovation. You can take that energy around culture and find ways to apply it to engage users. And when she says users, obviously she means customers. So 12 months on, something's changed. Clearly something's changed. Yahoo's stock price is now at its highest in 5 years. And talking to a range of people within Yahoo, from senior executives to employees at all levels, one thing that came through very strongly was they say that the change in culture is like night and day. So of course I asked the question, so what sort of changes have been made since Marissa Mayer turned over? The first one that comes up is one that many of us are aware of. It was quite controversial, and that was that she banned remote working. Now this seems completely counterintuitive to building a great culture, but the logic here from their point of view was that we need to get everyone on the same page. Yahoo people need to be connected to the business and to each other, and therefore we want people on site. The second thing that was offered up was she created a very compelling story, a vision and sense of purpose, something that everyone could rally behind. The third one, interesting, was about meals were made free on campus. Now the logic here wasn't free meals make happy people, but it was what occurred as a result of the free meals. It brought people together. Suddenly people were coming together in the cafeterias and the coffee shops around the campus. They were meeting, bumping into each other, building connections and talking. And the final point that was put forward was the frequency of face-to-face communication, starting right at the top. Yahoo's all hands in company meetings traditionally had been on a quarterly basis, and they were changed to weekly. What were they talking about? On every Friday afternoon at 4:30, as the whole organisation gathered, the thousands of people came together, they were talking about the progress that they'd made that week. What's the immediate focus for us and what's required from us all? They were asking questions that people have. And by shifting that from a quarterly focus to a weekly routine, what it was said was it changed the whole cadence or rhythm of the organisation. It really created more momentum, pace and positivity into the system.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Paul. And there's a very different sort of approach there. Not so much about the results, more about what you're doing to drive engagement within your business. And if I was to go back now to what Darren Hill was saying, he finished his post on the LinkedIn group by saying this. So until this concept shifts from engaged employees to engaging environments, from surveys to stories, from point in time to continuous feedback, it will continue to visit the loo and come back with the toilet roll stuck to the bottom of his shoe. Very eloquently put there, I think.
Lovely metaphor, Jez, yeah.
Lovely metaphor. So, you know, from our point of view, from TakeOn's point of view, what are we talking about? What is engagement? Well, our view is that engagement is an outcome. It's certainly not an input. And as Paul was saying, engagement comes from involvement and inclusion of the people in the business. Our approach would be quite straightforward and quite simple. Next time you get your engagement results, try taking this sort of an approach. First of all, focus on what's working. Yeah? Instead of just looking for all the areas where we're not, look for what's working. Maybe we start to analyze that data as much, if not more, than the other end of the scale. The second thing is about empowering people to engage themselves. Now, what I mean by that is not waiting for somebody to engage you, all right? Empower people to do it for themselves. And the third thing is about embedding engagement into the routines of the organization. Quite simply, you've got to make it business as usual. What do those three things look in practical terms? Well, maybe try and share a few examples with you from some of our case study clients. As far as from what's focus on what's working is concerned, we're talking about taking an appreciative approach. Now, what that might mean is shifting the focus a little bit. And the first thing is maybe instead of asking questions like, what is it like? We should be asking questions like, what could it be like? Or what should it be like? A very different mindset. Instead of focusing on what's working, what's not working, we should be focusing on what is working and look for the insights that tells us. And the last thing is maybe a change of management focus or management mindset. Instead of trying to catch them out, maybe we should try to start to catch them doing something right. Critically, the key thing here is probably to share that success story as well across the organization and get the whole organization talking about it. Give you an example of that. Within the Morrisons environment, over the 3 or 6 months that we worked in the lab store, that's one of the key things that we focused on, changing that leadership mindset from don't just turn up and tell them what they're doing wrong, turn up and tell them what they've done well. And you can see here a couple of quotes from some of the frontline workers. And you can see a different sort of engaged response coming back there. First of all, when I was coming to work, I'd always be thinking and worried about what Danny and John, the bosses, what sort of a mood they were in. All of a sudden, they were turning up in a positive mood, and that had an effect on me. That quote there at the end is really quite key. It's like management had a personality transplant. They talk to us and are a lot more positive. So what you can see here is they even sound like more engaged employees just because of a different management mindset. So what about empowering people? What about that part? Well, from our perspective, if your survey results are going to tell you that something's broken, the answer to that problem is probably within the system itself. It lies within. So why not get the business working on that problem and instead of trying to solve it yourself? Our approach is very much by involving the entire business, by driving some really meaningful dialogue and some meaningful conversations in there about the things that matter most. Yep, it's about changing the conversation. And as one CEO of one of our clients once said, he put it quite nicely when he said, the most important thing that we did to shift the culture was to change the conversations happening across the business. And I want to give you an example of that too. I'm going to show you a series of whiteboards here, a series of images that were taken from one of our UK clients. And quite simply, this was an idea that came out of one of those conversations in terms of how do we keep everybody up to date, how do we share information when we've got a team that's coming and going a lot. And so they came up with a radical idea of let's have a whiteboard and post some things on it. And interestingly, what you see here is the whiteboard that showed up on the first week. And it started with the simple question that's in a bubble in the middle. And the question was, what should senior management be working on? The board stayed quite blank for a couple of days until somebody decided to actually raise the courage to put something up there. And then all of a sudden, lots of people decided to contribute. But what you saw there were the ideas were very much things that other people could do. There was a lot of sort of blame mentality or victim mentality in some of the comments on there. So in week 2, we changed that conversation to what should you be working on? And all of a sudden, within a very short period of time, you get a much bigger, broader picture of an engaged team coming together and sharing some ideas. You probably can't make out most of those comments, but I can tell you that there's a very different balance to the comments that are written on there. Now they're talking about how they can suggest new ideas, how they can work better together. By the time they got to week 4 took care of itself because management didn't have to write any questions on the board. The questions came up on their own, and a staff member chose this one. How can we work better together with other teams? So you can see the shift in focus from very much what can other people do for me to how can we work better together with other teams. It's just a really good example of how you get the business talking and how easy it is. I guess our final point there is about embedding it into the business routines of the organization. And you may well have seen this chart before, and it's nothing new. Don't make engagement once a year. That's just not sustainable. What you really need to do is to start to think about the themes that your employee engagement throws up and work those themes into the routines, the communication routines within your business. When I say communication routines, I'm talking about the managers coming together to talk about stuff. I'm talking about teams coming together to talk about what's important. And I'm talking about daily, weekly, and monthly routines. What might that look like? Well, here's an example of an engagement series that we put on for one of our clients. Now, there's a few things happening here. The first thing is a focus on success. I'm a firm believer in start with the end in mind. So what does good look like? What would success look like? The second thing is a stream of managers coming together to talk about what skills and capabilities do we need. And the third thing is groups of teams coming together to talk about what's important to them and how they can improve. And at the end of that process, there's a constant review process, talking about, right, if we've changed the conversation, what has the result been? Where have we moved? What's been the most significant change? So in summary, it's about those 3 things. First of all, focus on what's working. Yeah. Focus on the results that are your best results and find out why are they your best results. What are you doing to drive them? Secondly, it's about empowering your people and get them to work on the most important stuff and the stuff that your survey tells you should be working on. And the third thing is about embedding it through routines. Make it part of the way that you do things around here. And I hope that sort of makes sense. Now, if you do those 3 things, what sort of results can you expect? Well, why don't we go back to our case study, Paul?
Yeah, thanks, Jez. Let's just wrap up with Morrison's again, where those principles were applied and those sort of routines were put in place over that period of 6 months. We talked about the fact that the engagement score went from 55 to 70% within that period of time. Go a level down, and there were some more interesting things actually happening. This question, again, as part of the surveying that was done, this company brings out the best in me, increased a whopping 33 percentage points from a rather low 35% up to 68. Dig another layer down, and the sorts of things that are driving that change in attitude, that belief about bringing out the best in me, were things like, well, now I can speak up and challenge the way things are done. I'm encouraged to find better ways to do my job. I can contribute ideas on how the team works together. And I'm getting much more positive feedback about what I'm doing well from managers. So you can see these are really pivotal things about driving that really underpin the drive and engagement. So when we talk about how you should approach the results from an engagement survey, really for us it's applying the same principles that we have in TakeON for everything else. And that is, you've got to get people involved. And at the heart of that is communication, conversation, and collaboration. That's where you want to start. Don't set it up as a project.
Absolutely, Paul. And I guess, so coming towards the end of this webinar now, what can you do next? What are the next steps available to you? Well, as Paul says, if one of the things is about changing the conversation and getting people involved, here's an alternative for you. Maybe we can help you with that. What you see here is what's called the Business Connection Pulse Check. This is a very different take on an employee engagement survey. It's very much dialogue based. It's about bringing people together, and it's much more about stories than it is about scores. Yeah, absolutely, let's take a score, but really what we do is try and capture some of the stories that lie behind those views. Now the Business Connection Pulse Check, Chrissy will tell you how you can get a hold of that. You can either do it yourself. It's a really simple process, and I'm willing to bet that any manager in your organization will be able to run that. But also you might want to think about involving a local TakeON partner to help you with that. Chrissy, why don't you tell us how you can get hold of that? But I will just add one thing before I close off, and that is, if you do use it, there is a caveat. Don't ignore the good stuff that comes out of it, all right? Make the good stuff your focus instead.
Thanks, Jez, and also thanks to Paul for your insights. We'd also like to thank you, our audience, for your time. Now we're going to stay online just for a couple of minutes to answer some questions, so please start typing your questions in, anything that you'd like us to talk about. But first I'd just like to explain what's going to happen next. Now if you want to learn more about TakeON, then please visit our website and you'll find some really exciting tools and resources that are updated regularly. So go to takeon.biz. Now you can also download the Business Connection Pulse Check tool that Jez talked about, and simply click on the free tool link, which you'll find on the front page. Now you'll each receive an email in the next few days with a link to the recording of this session, and we'd love you to share this with colleagues, friends and anyone else you know that would benefit from this. Now if you need to leave the session now, please don't forget to complete the survey. We'd really appreciate your feedback. Okay, so we're going to stay on now for question and answer time. So the first question we'll start with, and I'll hand this over to you, Jez, is you say focus on the positive, but what about the ones that are really disengaged?
Thanks, Chrissy. That's a good question. I think Lorraine put this question forward. Yeah, well, there are always those people, Lorraine, that are disengaged. I guess, if you look at that typical organizational pie, you've got, what is it, 10 or 15% at the top that are, you might call your stars. You've got a whole bunch of people in the middle, the 60% that are either engaged or disengaged, depending on what frame of mind they're in that day. And down at the bottom, you've got those disengaged people. I guess the take-on approach would be not to ignore the disengaged, but don't focus all your attention on them. And don't fall into that trap of only looking for the bad stuff and only listening to the cynics. I guess it makes more sense from a take-on point of view to pay more attention to the top half of the circle. I mean, I guess, the stars have... they've earned their right for a voice, if you like, and maybe they're the most important people to listen to, rather than trying to keep happy the disengaged sort of minority. Because, to be honest, you may well never please the disengaged, and it's a number that sort of rolls over time. So my advice would be, don't ignore them, but focus your attention on the top instead of the bottom.
Okay, there's another question here from Maggie, and she's asked, for very large organisations, where do you suggest the most impactful place to start is? Which players? Great question, thanks Maggie. And I guess the starting point, that is from the top. There's a very strong relationship between engagement or an organisational climate and the perceptions that people in the organisation have of those leaders. So in the Yahoo case study, for example, that I'm talking about, there is absolutely no doubt that it started from the top. And that's why they've got such massive momentum in a short space of time. Putting that aside, what we would also say is come back to what's working. Where is the opportunity? Where is it resonating? Where are the points that you can build on in the organisation? Because it's all about creating that momentum and, if you like, forcing that sort of social change, that tipping point. So often it's a good idea to just start in some of those areas where there's fertile land and really get some momentum happening there, and then that will start to influence other parts of the organisation.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, we're actually going to close the webinar session off now, so thanks again very much for your time. Now, if you do have other questions that you want to ask us, then feel free to email them through or put them through via the webinar, and we will answer them in the next couple of days. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you or talking to you at the next webinar session. Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.